Hello, Buzz Killers. It's me. You know it's me. You can tell by the sound of my voice. We did a show a couple of years ago about the medical researcher J. Marion Sims and the outrages he perpetrated on enslaved women for his study of women's health and midwifery and things like that. And he became known, of course, as the father of gynecology on the basis of this research. And there were even statues put up to him and all that sort of thing. Those have been largely taken down across the country. But we never really find out, or we never really know about the women that he operated on, the women that he abused in this way. All that's going to end now today because we have with us, of course, the great author J.C. Hallman, who's written Say Anarcha, a young woman, a devious surgeon, and the harrowing birth of modern women's health. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's good to be here.
This is a wonderful book. And I'm so glad we got to talk to you because I know that you are being maybe not hounded by the media, but you're on a lot of other podcasts. You're on a lot of talk shows talking about these discoveries that you made. Please tell us, first of all, what prompted you to try to find this woman and by extension, all the women that Sims operated on?
I'll back up to your intro a little bit and point out, the book is a dual biography. It's simultaneously about Sims. It's an attempt to deconstruct his false biographical facade and really examine his true motives in what he was doing. And it's also an attempt to excavate the life story of the young woman known as Anarcha, who was the most consequential of the approximately 10 young enslaved women, experimental subjects, who formed the core of Sims' experiments in an attempt to cure vesicovaginal fistula. That set of experiments stands at the center of the creation story of modern women's health. So all women living today, owe a debt to that young group of enslaved teenagers and to Anarcha herself. And, I wanted to back up and talk about Sims a bit because you mentioned something about his monuments. And there were three. There are three in the country, and one was removed. There are two others that are still in place. And that, frankly, is an outrage. But when I first heard about this story and I started to dive into the research for it, and this was a deeper, darker rabbit hole than I'd ever gone down into for any book. And almost all my work is heavily researched nonfiction. But what I noticed right away was that although the reexamination of Sims' legacy had been ongoing for 50 years, there had not been an effort to find any evidence of Anarcha or any of the young women that Sims experimented on that did not come from him. He was the only source. So everyone who was writing about him was essentially trusting Sims, and nobody regarded this guy as a good source. So when I first set out to find Anarcha, and when I did make the first discovery of her name in a document from 1828, it was the first time that anybody had seen anything that even proved that this young woman had existed. And I felt like that not only validated her, but it also served as a necessary corrective to that false legacy that has stood as objective fact in history for almost 200 years.
And Sims, you're talking mainly about Sims's research notes or his medical notes, the notes of the surgery explaining what he did. And as you say, there's very little about the women themselves as people. And as you read them, you sort of get the impression that, he thinks he's operating on animals, or he's operating on slabs of meat, or he's operating on, inanimate objects. It's very cold and it's very dismissive of their humanity.
Yeah, I mean, and that was very true for a lot of doctors at the time. I mean, the world was in the process of changing. There was a medical secret society that actually started up in medical schools among students that was trying to kickstart interest in medical ethics. And the work of Claude Bernard in terms of thinking about the rights of patients, that would be happening in the 1850s. So we're talking about this bridge period in the 1830s and 1840s when there were still a lot of surgeons that come from what they call the heroic schools School of Medicine. And they were, Sims in particular was very, very quick to leap to human trials in ways that disturbed even some of his colleagues. But he wasn't alone. This was a time, particularly for enslaved people, when they weren't regarded as fully human. And so Sims could justify this to himself. And then that's just the period we're looking at.
Yeah. Well, let's remind the buzzkillers of what he actually did medically, what sort of surgeries he did and what examinations he did.
Sims was a kind of general surgeon in Montgomery, Alabama in the early 1840s. He'd been a plantation doctor for some time, but really felt himself called toward kind of glory of surgery when doctors would work fast and would be very bloody. And there was a particular kind of glory associated with that. I don't think is so different from how surgeons are thought of even today. Obviously very different from them, but a similar kind of reputation. But when Sims moved into Montgomery in 1840, he started to just focus on surgery, but he was really looking for the thing that would help him make his name. He got into medicine specifically to pursue wealth and fame. And so he was doing things like, experimenting on enslaved men who had cancers on their face or cancers of the jaw. He was doing fairly bizarre sounding experiments on enslaved babies that were suffering from infant lockjaw or tetanus. And then Anarcha came along, the young woman at the center of the story, and he performed a forceps delivery of her baby. And then not long after that, she began to leak urine from her vagina because she had acquired what was called a vesicovaginal fistula or an obstetric fistula, a fistula that results from prolonged obstructed labor. And Sims had never seen this before. He turned the case away at first because he said he hated the diseases of the female pelvis. And then he encountered another case in an enslaved woman known as Betsy, same thing. And a month after that, another case in an enslaved woman known as Lucy. And he suddenly had all these cases on his hands, and he was researching it, and he realized this was a condition that had stymied the medical community for hundreds of years. And he thought to himself, well, I hate this kind of medicine, but if I could cure this, that'd be something. And so he decided to set about a series of experiments to cure this condition using a device known as the clamp suture was the thing that he wanted to attach his name to and get credit for that. And so he spent about 3.5 years experimenting on Anarcha, Lucy, Betsy, and approximately 7 other women in a small infirmary for enslaved persons that he had been working out of in his backyard in downtown Montgomery for about 5 years at that point.
And how many women do we know he worked on?
At that site, there were approximately 10 in that initial group. And then in the years after that, because the experiments didn't end then, people think that the experiments ended with the success that Sims claimed to have achieved on Anarcha in 1849. But he didn't publish about it until 1852. And there were other cases that arrived after that in 1849, and he kept experimenting on them. And so, the total number of women that he was experimenting on between 1846 and before he left Alabama for New York City in 1853 is probably on the order of 15 or 16. But the women who were part of that initial group was about 10.
Right. And of course, as everyone knows from our first show, and as we'll know from reading your book, it's not as if he asked these women for permission to do this work.
Right. Yeah, no, he certainly didn't. There is one source, a very obscure article where Sims says he obtained permission from Anarcha, Lucy, Betsy, and the others. But that's kind of the exception. In the 4 or 5 other times where Sims talked about this, he explained that he only went to these women's enslavers for permission to experiment on their property.
And what do we know about, the veracity of his claims of success? You said that he claimed to have cured things.
Yeah.
And or claimed that his research led to the discovery of cures of other things. How much of this might have been true and how much was overblown?
The real truth is, and it's almost hard to believe, but not only was it not true, it wasn't even overblown. It was just entirely fraudulent. And, and I did a big deep dive into Sims' career. I went deeper into his career than I believe anybody else has gone, because the people who have tended to write about Sims have usually focused on a fairly narrow slice of his career, the 4 years in Alabama, maybe a little bit outside of that. I mean, we had decades of the rest of his career and made all sorts of other claims as well. And it just turns out that it isn't true. That the creation story of modern women's health has been that the father of gynecology started his career with the cure of Anarcha in 1849. That's not true. My work eventually found that Anarcha was never cured. She was experimented on further in Richmond, and then again in New York City in 1857 by Sims again. And then, I found evidence of her having the comorbidities of ongoing fistula condition until the very end of her life. And I traced her life story all the way to the lonely forest in Virginia where she's buried and under a marked stone. And it's not the only case. I mean, I think with Sims, the thing that is important to remember is that those of us who are challenging Sims' legacy at this point, and there's a whole chorus of poets and journalists and scholars and historians and playwrights and artists, and it's a vast chorus of voices. We're not projecting modern values into the past. That's the big argument. That's the argument about the Sims monuments and about monuments in general. What is important to recognize about Sims, at least in my work, is that I'm looking at what his colleagues were saying about him. I'm looking at what his contemporaries were saying about him. Sims' greatest critics, the two men who became his greatest critics, were his assistant in Alabama and his assistant in New York City.
The two people who presumably knew him and knew the work best.
Yes, the ones who were sitting right beside him as he worked. They went on to become his greatest critics. And the critic from Alabama, the assistant from Alabama, Nathan Bozeman, specifically when it comes to the fistula experiments, is that he said Sims' cure worked about half the time. Sims claimed it was perfect, that it worked every time. And his assistant said, no, it worked about half the time. And on top of that, the clamp suture, the thing that Sims was trying to stake his entire career and reputation on, he published about it in 1852. And by 1856, it was completely abandoned.
Yeah.
So Sims was able to take a false cure and turn it into a career before anybody kind of caught on. And by that point, the tipping point of his career and his publicity had been reached, and he was on his way to becoming the father of gynecology.
And I think this is so important because, historians are often critiqued by people who don't know what they're talking about. They're often critiqued using what's called presentism, using the values of the late 20th, early 21st century, and projecting them back onto people in the past and saying, oh, this was a bad man, even though in theory, in his day, and I'm putting that in quotation marks, buzzkillers, it wasn't considered bad, but it's not true. We find way back into the 18th century, there are hundreds of critics of slavery and the slave trade. And then there are even these direct, very eyewitness critics of Sims. So, presentism can be a bad thing, but in every case that I try to follow up when I hear it from Bill Maher and other celebrity analysts, as I call them, it's just not true. There are tons of contemporary critics. Yeah. People contemporary to the people we're talking about. So the morals of the time were much more in line with what we think now than these so-called, these talking heads who complain about us.
Yeah, it's definitely the case that Sims had his champions and he had his apologists, for not only while he was alive, but, for 100 years after his death. And even recently, there are Sims apologists who are sort of lying low these days because the tide has turned, but they're still out there. And so it was always the case that the problem wasn't ever just J. Marion Sims. It was the broader male medical establishment that was holding him. And it was that male medical establishment that got him elected to his term as president of the American Medical Association. But what is important to remember is that although there were many white male doctors who were part of the problem, there were also many white male doctors who were blowing the whistle on Sims. There were even former presidents of the AMA. Alexander Stevens, who was the second president of the AMA, offered very dire warnings about what would happen if people followed in Sims' footsteps. And other doctors listening to Stevens said, well, look, he was right. Look at what's happened. And then another president of the AMA named William O. Baldwin knew Sims in Montgomery and probably was one of the doctors in attendance when Sims was performing his fistula operations. And Baldwin was very critical of Sims' work on infant lockjaw, and they feuded for decades. So there are many, many other examples, Moritz Schubert and A. Reeves Jackson and a whole bunch of other doctors who were calling attention to this fraudulent legacy, who were arguing on behalf of a humbler profession. And of course, it's not surprising. If you're arguing on behalf of a humbler profession, it's not surprising that those voices are going to get drowned out over time by the voices who want doctors to have statues erected to them. And then that's what happened. Even though all those contemporary critics existed, their work tended to fade into the background. So the deep dive that I did was going way beyond looking at the sources of just Sims himself, but looking at many other doctors who knew him or encountered him to find out, what was his true reputation among the people who knew him, and not just the people who were seduced by celebrity and fame and wealth.
Yeah, and I think there isn't enough talked about that. Lots of people talk about the horrible nature of the surgeries and the horrible treatment of the patients, but the self-promotion and all that crap, frankly, isn't talked enough about. But really, who we're not talking enough about so far in the show is Anarcha herself. So let's start there. The story you tell in the first part of the book about, first of all, discovering her and all the interesting things that had to happen in order for that discovery to be made was fascinating. But please walk the Buzzkillers through how you found out more about her than just what Sims had written in his medical notes.
Sure. At first it was easy, because Sims had said that in his autobiography that Anarcha came from a plantation owned by a family named Westcott in Montgomery. So it was just a question of getting...
By the way, we're going to move across a few states here because of where she lives. So this is Montgomery,
Alabama. Yeah. And that's where the original experiments took place. And so, just getting to an archive in Alabama and getting to the Westcott plantation inventories, which they had, and which I discovered at that time, archivists who, and I have to back up a little bit and say, look, I would not have been able to write this book. I would not have found nearly as much as I would have found without the help of librarians and archivists all across the country. But it was also the case that sometimes I encountered archivists who were more gatekeepers. And so when I first started looking for Anarcha in archives in Alabama, I was told, oh, you're not going to find anything about slavery. Nothing, there's nothing in there. And I was actively discouraged, and I just didn't give up. I kept showing up. And then finally, I remember that moment when there was an archivist they kind of took a deep sigh and they were like, ah. And then they said, you got to go talk to this person.
Yeah.
And then the floodgate opened. They just got tired of me being persistent, and then I found Anarcha. I found her in these 1828 inventories, which was very telling. I was able to tell a lot about her early life. On the Westcott plantation in 1828, there were 29 enslaved people on the plantation at that time. And then in 1841, there were 80 enslaved people. In a 13-year period. They went from 29 to 80, and there were 30 enslaved people who were younger than 13 years old. And if you know anything about the 1830s and the growth of the cotton trade, the crash of the cotton prices in 1837, it just becomes overwhelming evidence that plantation was breeding enslaved people. And it is unavoidable that Anarcha's own pregnancy that resulted in her fistula and sent her on a path to encounter Sims would have come from a breeding program that was in place, that was common to plantations in the area at that time. And that kind of a breeding program also would have been why Sims was finding it economically viable to try to find a cure for this particular condition. So, it started there, and eventually I had to figure out sort of what happened to Anarcha, because one of the curious things was that Sims had never offered a whole lot of early detail about Anarcha and Lucy and Betsy. What he eventually said about them didn't come until the end of his life. So
Mm.
what was very curious was that no doctor who witnessed him performing his experiments, many of whom went on to publish many things, none of them ever wrote about it. And even the doctor, Nathan Bozeman, who showed up in Montgomery and became Sims' assistant in June of 1849, which is exactly when Sims says that he cured Anarcha, Bozeman never saw Anarcha. Bozeman never saw Lucy or Betsy or any of those other early cases. And what happened to them? They just dropped off the map. And eventually I got a little bit lucky in figuring out that who the owner of Betsy had been, a guy named Nathan Harris. And I found records of his plantation in Autauga County. And I was lucky because he died before emancipation.
Mm.
So he got like yellow fever and he died or something. And if he hadn't died, if he'd lived until emancipation, we might never have known what happened to Anarcha. But in Nathan Harris's papers, I found references to Anarcha, to Lucy, to Betsy, all of them on the same piece of paper. The only time any record contains all three of those names on the same piece of paper. And then that began to give me a trajectory. And then in separate discoveries, I found Anarcha in the case record books from Women's Hospital in New York City. In 1853, Sims left Alabama, went to New York, opened a hospital there. And then Anarcha popped up in New York City to be experimented on again, revealing that she was never truly cured.
Right.
That case record indicated that she'd been experimented on for several years in Richmond. So I was able to follow up on that. And then I had the name of a new enslaver. The man who was enslaving her as of 1856 was a man named William L. Morey. And then that turned out to be an entire new avenue of exploration, and eventually was able to determine that the Moreys had a large family home in Bowling Green, Virginia, that Anarcha likely had a cabin on that property somewhere for a number of years before she was leased finally to a man in King George, Virginia, which is where she married and spent the last 7 years of her life and where she died.
Okay, so what do we know about what happened to Anarcha and how her life played out after the operation and after she moved and all that sort of thing?
Well, we know that it was a peripatetic life. That she spent a number of years in Richmond where she was experimented on in a building called the Egyptian Building, which still exists and which is part of VCU now.
That's Virginia Commonwealth University for the buzzkillers who don't already know.
And, and she lived for a time on a plantation in Bowling Green, Virginia. But we also know that earlier in life that she very likely was involved in this very serious train accident in Connecticut. How she went from Alabama to New York and Richmond. There's a little bit of conjecture and guesswork there, as you might expect when trying to piece together the life story of an enslaved person who didn't leave behind much record. But there's definitely a scaffold, a skeleton of primary sources. I'm a creative writer, but this is the weird situation where a creative writer did all of the primary source digging, finding all of the actual documents that haven't been used before in any other account of Sims' life or of Anarcha's life. And so there is this scaffold that you can look at. And then what I did is, rather than invent freely around that scaffold, what I did is I went to the Works Progress Administration Federal Writers Project slave narrative project that was conducted in the late 1930s. Several thousand formerly enslaved people were interviewed, and those interviews were turned into monologues, oral histories that fill about 55 books worth of material. And I read them all. It took a year. And then I was more like a curator of this book in a lot of ways than I was like its writer, because what I did is I took those voices and those facts and I used those to complete Anarcha's story. The creators of the slave narratives called them a composite autobiography. And so, in taking all of those facts and turning them into a collage that augmented the skeletal primary source record of Anarcha's life, I was able to create something, I hope, that is an innovative way of telling a story that for many years people thought you just couldn't tell.
And finding her, the story of how her grave is found is an amazing one.
Yeah, I had a letter that described her and her condition, and I knew it came from a guy named Charles Mason, and I didn't know anything about him. I was in Caroline County, Virginia, which is where Bowling Green is, and that's where Anarcha had lived for a time, but there were no Charles Masons in Caroline County. And so I kept searching, and finally, and I'm on the ground. This isn't work you can do on Ancestry. Ancestry
Yeah.
Ancestry is like the Wikipedia of genealogical research. It's kind of good as a starting point, but unless you're on the ground, you're going to have a real hard time. And so I'm just driving around. I'm going from probate office to probate office in various counties around Caroline County. And then finally I find Charles Mason in King George County. And I ask around and everybody says, you got to talk to Elizabeth Lee, who was like the local historian of King George County. And for a time, she wasn't answering her phone. She wasn't answering emails. And I eventually just went to King George, asked somebody where she was. It's the South. So they gave me her address.
Mm-hmm.
And I showed up and I knocked on her door, and she's 80 years old. And, she works on her book every day. And, it's all she does. She doesn't have any need for emails and voicemail and stuff. And I tell her what I'm doing. And she just immediately gets in the car with me, and we ride up to the little historical society, and we sit down. And I start telling her the story, these experiments in Alabama and the history of women's health and J. Marion Sims and this important young woman named Anarcha. And as soon as I say that name, she sits up in her chair and she says, wait a minute. And she goes to a book and she pulls it down. And there's a record for Anarcha and Lorenzo Jackson on the property where I knew Anarcha had come from.
Mm-hmm.
And, and it turned out over time that her name had morphed from one thing to another. And in fact, the name that we're all familiar with, Anarcha, spelled Anarcha, that only ever occurred in Sims' autobiography. It was something more like Anarcha originally. And that's actually close to where it wound up and what's on her gravestone. And so, it took a while from there because, she had to tell me the story of how this broken off headstone had been found deep in a remote Virginia forest by a hunter, almost covered over with leaves and dirt. That guy happened to be an amateur genealogist. So he brought the information back to Elizabeth Lee. Elizabeth Lee took me to see that guy, and then he walked me out there. That was 2017, so I was still gathering at that point, and then that was the end of the search for Anarcha, but it was just the beginning of my process of telling her story. But without that hunter, his name's Jim Petrie, and without Elizabeth Lee, who died in 2021, shortly after finishing her own book, that Anarcha would not have been found. And that was one of just a whole handful of needles in haystacks. I've got like a big collection of needles. And so, but that was sort of the process of how I managed to piece together Anarcha's story.
Well, and it's very important we say this all the time on the show, every country is very big and every country has its own local history societies and local history groups. And these can be excellent, as you found in this case, although it's difficult to get to the final person. I'm afraid what's all too common in the United States, and particularly all too common in the South, is to find local historical societies who are only interested in, either the lost cause narrative or not talking about slavery at all or celebrating big white landed families, and will shut down and won't even bother doing research into all the other people who live there. So this is I don't want to say this King George County was the exception, because I don't know that as a fact. How many local historical societies are good and how many local societies aren't. But the fact that this was a good one with excellent people in it really made a huge difference.
Well, yeah, and I'll point out, I'm now working with, a number of organizations local to King George. The one I can talk about who's sort of officially involved is the King George Historical Society. Elizabeth Lee was president of that organization. We have since managed to identify descendants of the people who are buried in the grave with Anarcha, and meaning her husband. And there's an effort to make sure that grave is protected. And I mean, that's kind of where things stand right now. That effort is ongoing, but the King George Historical Society is playing a big role in that. And so, as I
Hmm.
said, I did encounter organizations, both for the Anarcha side of the story and the Sims side of the story, that did not particularly want to be helpful, that would much rather have just sort of left the past be the past. And
Oh, yeah.
but I never encountered that in King George. Every organization I spoke to there was very anxious to tell the story and to get the truth out there.
Well, also, I think it's interesting how there's sort of, I mean, this is somewhat coincidental. I don't want to make too much of this because, the Sims statue, at least the one in New York, comes down at the same time Anarcha's gravestone is, I don't want to say resurrected, but risen up, is discovered and found. So her star is rising at the same time his is falling. And I found that a very fascinating aspect of your dual biography.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the goals, and I think I'm not alone. Not alone in that. There are many others who are working to center and celebrate Anarcha's story and to make it part of a larger, ongoing reckoning with race and medical health disparities in our country, which is, undeniably a good thing. But it was the dual nature of that. It always sort of struck me as kind of, embodying that idea of truth and reconciliation.
Right.
Anarcha is the truth and Sims is the reconciliation.
Yeah.
And we're acknowledging this really flawed history and we're identifying the new facts of Anarcha's life that tell us a lot about who she was and how she lived.
Earlier, when you were talking about the end of Anarcha's life and you following it all the way through, you were talking about how this is sort of a new way to do this sort of history. And now that we've talked about local historical societies, now we've talked about how important all this stuff is, how do you feel the book is going to help people understand Sims, obviously, but also Anarcha and people like her?
I think for Sims, I think I could approach Sims in a relatively traditional way, using the sort of typical tools of history and biography. And I think that, recognizing that his history was entirely fraudulent, but that he had yet to be exposed. I sort of went into the story of him thinking of myself as a kind of prosecutor. I was gathering the evidence and I was going to create a narrative that fit with all of the evidence and prosecute the case against J. Marion Sims in a way that it really hadn't been done before. And I think for Anarcha, I sort of proceeded with Anarcha the way that archaeologists do when they create the skeleton of the tyrannosaur that you see when you walk into the Natural History Museum. You walk in and you behold this thing and you think, wow, this is what it's like to be in the presence of this creature from the distant past. And then you realize, well, they're not really bones, they're casts. And that probably it's compiled from 3 different animals that were discovered in Mongolia and Colorado and Manitoba. And maybe they had 40% of an animal and they just guessed the rest. And then they put it all together and they said, here it is. This is what it feels like. That's the popular version of our science. And that's very similar to what I did with Anarcha, proceeding the way that the hard sciences proceed to show a general audience what the fruits of their labor look like. And I think for Anarcha's story, what that does is it demonstrates that those who are lost do not have to remain so. And even the most difficult story can be got out with lots of hard work, with a little bit of luck, and with a little bit of innovation to what we think of as the rules of history and biography.
Well, you mentioned near the very beginning of the show that there were 3 statues of Sims, only one of which has come down. We need to see a statue of Anarcha erected, at the very least, to represent all of the women that Sims operated on and all of the women who were operated on without any permission at all.
Yeah.
And maybe even to represent, I mean, in many ways, Johns Hopkins has done a very good job in the 21st century of recognizing the life and the contribution of Henrietta Lacks, who we've also done a show on. There needs to be a lot more of that.
Yeah.
Public displays.
Yeah. And very happily there is, not only are there the poets and the artists that I've talked about, playwrights, but by far the most robust of those efforts to honor Anarcha's legacy is the work of Michelle Browder in Montgomery, who has created the Mothers of Gynecology Monument and the Morop Camp.
Mm-hmm.
And anybody who's interested can Google that and to find out a whole lot more about what Michelle Browder is doing.
Yes. Well, we encourage Buzzkillers to do that. And also, we want to thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Buzzkillers, as you know, say Anarcha, a young woman, a devious surgeon, and the harrowing birth of modern women's health is on the Buzzkill bookshelf. And for those of you fortunate Patreon members, we have a free copy to send you. So watch your Patreon email, and we will be offering the book up. And in fact, it is an advanced reader's copy, so you will sort of get let in on the club of special people who get to read books before they're published. So thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you.
And please tell us what you're working on now so we can interview you next year.
I got a few things going on. I'm looking at the life of Thurgood Marshall, a couple of things he worked on that I would love to dive into more fully.
Well, you're on the hook now. Once you've been on once, you're on again.
Wonderful.
So,
can't wait.
Buzzkillers, we will talk to all of you next week.